My name is Nikki Johnston, and I'm with Transition Advisors. Our webinar today is Innovative Approaches to M&A Deal Structures for Firms Seeking to Acquire for Growth. Before we begin, we'll need to cover just a few important items. First, please close any other programs running on your computer. This will help to ensure quality presentation and reduce any audio issues. Transition Advisors, LLC is a proud and approved sponsor on the National Registry of CPA Sponsors per NASBA. In order for you to receive your 1 CPE credit, you must complete 2 requirements. First, you must participate in all 3 of the polling questions throughout today's presentation. And please note that GoToWebinar does monitor your participation today. Next, an online evaluation will appear immediately after the session ends. That must be completed before we can send your certificate of completion. So please take a moment to complete that survey before you close your browser after the webinar today. Once both of those requirements are met, the certificate will be emailed to you within 10 business days. In order for you to fully participate in the webinar, please take a moment to familiarize yourself with GoToWebinar control panel. At the right-hand side of your screen, there's an orange arrow. You can use that to minimize the control panel. During the presentation, all participants are muted, but you can communicate with us by using the question box toward the bottom of the panel. Just type your question in the box and click Send. Questions are important to us, and our presenter today will answer your questions throughout the presentation as time permits. Finally, I'd like to remind you that Transition Advisors offers a free 1-hour CPE webinar each month. We have an additional one this month coming up next week, specifically for those in Texas. And other topics that are coming up include valuing your accounting practice and a 2004 accounting update. For a complete list of all of our webinars, including the links to register for them, you can visit the CPE courses section of our website, transitionadvisors.com. As a reminder, you received a link in the email earlier today, and if you'd like to download the slides, you can click on that link. I've also just sent it out through the chat function now in case you want to follow along. And if you have any questions after the webinar or would like for me to email you a PDF of the slides, you can always just reply to the reminder email that you received, and that will go directly to me. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's session. Terry Putney is the CEO of Transition Advisors. We thank you very much for attending, and we hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Nikki. Just a little more introduction to Transition Advisors in the event you're not fully familiar with us. We are a full-service national consulting firm. We work strictly with accounting firms on ownership transition issues. There's 3 general areas where we're involved with those issues. One would be deal facilitation, which is conducting searches, looking for matches between buyers and sellers. Facilitating the introduction of those firms, helping in negotiations. As a part of those deals, we also offer transaction support, which involves, of course, the contract, designing contracts and structuring deals and valuing firms and assisting with due diligence. We also provide that service to firms when we don't make the introductions, when parties have found themselves or each other and need help with putting a deal together. We're seeing that happen more and more often. And then in the practice management area, working with firms on their owner agreements, which often involves helping with partner compensation issues, how to value the firm internally for retirements, how to value the firm for bringing in new partners, helping firms assess their readiness to provide internal succession for their retiring partners, which of course is a huge issue nowadays. I'd also like to suggest that if you have any questions, please ask those during the session in the chat room, and we'll try to answer those during the session. If we don't get to all the questions, we will provide a detailed response after the session by email to everybody. So if there's anything that that comes up that you want to ask about, please do. And then if you think of something after this webinar, don't hesitate to send me an email. My email address is at the end of the webinar, and I'll answer any questions that I can as fully as I can. So, the key to creating value in an acquisition of an accounting firm is to have a successful transition. This seems like a fundamental, and basically you think of that as, well, I want to keep all the clients that I bought. it seems like a fundamental issue, and it's, sort of like, well, why would you even have to state that, of course, and that's why most deals are contingent on client retention. However, the reason why most deals fail, in my opinion, even though they are contingent, or not most deals fail, because most deals don't fail, but the ones that do fail, the reason why they do, is because too many buyers don't address the business plan that's required to create a very good transition. Instead, they rely entirely on, the fact that the deal is contingent, and I'm only paying for what sticks, the clients that stay, and why should I worry about it otherwise? And they sort of let nature take its own course. And of course, then there's no specific plan between the buyer and seller for how the transition is going to occur, whose role is going to, what each person's role is, how long it's going to take, what the specific steps are we're going to have. And so we end up with, gee, after 2 or 3 years, the seller's gone, we've lost half the clients, seller's not happy, we're not happy. And even though a buyer in those circumstances hasn't paid for necessarily any clients that were lost if the deal was structured properly, it still is very costly to have a deal that has that kind of outcome, because there's so much other investment that you're making. There's so much issues dealing with now having maybe excess staff, having a plan that failed, feeling like, yes, are we going to ever do this again? The last one we did didn't work. So none of the strategic objectives we had were achieved. So it's not good enough just to have a contingent deal. You need to have, a good transition plan. And we're going to talk about throughout the course of this webinar how to create a more powerful transition plan than just a contingent deal will set up on its own. With that, we're going to go into our first polling question. I apologize for doing one so quick, but we have to do 3 during the course of this hour. So, Nikki, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and launch the poll. This one is about your current level of interest in M&A. Your options there are you're experienced and currently looking. You've never done a deal, but you're actively looking for one. You're not sure, but you're intrigued. You're more interested in merging upstream, or you're not sure overall. So take a few moments here. And just keep in mind that you do have to answer all 3 of the polls in order to get the CPE credit for today. Okay, I'll go ahead and close the poll, share the results there. It looks like 38% of the folks on the call are experienced and currently looking. Another third are not sure, and then a pretty even split between never done a deal but looking for one and intrigued.
Okay. Well, it's good to know we've got some experience on the line. Hopefully I'll come up with something you haven't thought of in the past and help you with your it'll help you do your next deal better. What's on a seller's mind, and why should you even care, actually? Knowing, let me just walk you through what some of the things are that sellers tend to think of. Knowing where a seller is coming from helps you in a couple of ways. First, it helps you become a better communicator when it can make yourself more attractive to them when you understand where they're coming from. Needless to say, successful negotiations occur not when one party crams something down the other party's throat, but when you find a common ground. And when both parties feel like they walked away from a negotiation a winner, you've got the best outcome. And the second reason why it helps to have in mind where a seller's coming from emotionally is it helps you overcome objections. As they bring things up, sometimes they're saying one thing and meaning something else, or meaning something different than you're interpreting. So, for example, nobody can serve my clients like me. I hear this all the time. And, of course, my first response to someone who's a seller who tells me that is, well, if we can't successfully transition your practice, it doesn't have any value. So we need to get out of that way of thinking, and we need to find a way to successfully transition it to someone else. But it doesn't ever really leave their mind that they have a personal relationship with their clients. They've worked with many of them for 20 or 30 years. They can't imagine that someone else is going to be able to take their place. And so, for instance, when a seller asks you for a guaranteed minimum in a purchase price, or when they ask you for a shorter retention deal, hey, I only want a 1-year retention deal, or no retention deal at all, it may not be, and you respond to them from the standpoint of, well, those terms don't make sense to me, I would never do that. If you understand where they're really coming from is, I'm concerned whether or not you're going to be my clients, and I haven't heard you tell me something yet that's going to give me more comfort that you are going to be able to keep my clients. And so when you address it from that standpoint, say, gee, let me be more specific with you. I'm just as interested in keeping your clients as you are, and this is how we're going to go about it. When they say, I don't want to give up, when they say, for instance, I want equity in your firm, and you're not willing to give equity because they're not large enough, they're not going to be around long enough, oftentimes they're not really interested in the equity. What they're interested in is they feel like that gives them more control. It's a proxy for control. They want a seat at the table. So oftentimes you can address the issue of, control in a way other than, granting equity in a deal. I don't want to retire just yet. I'm not sure when I want to retire. I can't be specific about it. And oftentimes someone will say, well, I may want to work. And of course, most firms aren't having 70-year-old. They'll say, well, we're not interested in doing that. The thing is, I'm not sure when I really want to quit working altogether. You have to ask is, well, you really want to work 500 hours a year when you're 69 and 70 years old? Not that. I'd like to start slowing down. And oftentimes we can find a place where they will start slowing down sooner instead of working full-time all the way to 70. So again, thinking about what's on a seller's mind can help you in the negotiation. The factors that affect value, we're going to address each of these in detail in the subsequent slides. The terms of the deal have a direct impact on the value of the deal. The location, the market, the level of competition in that market. In other words, if we're talking about a practice that's in a very small market like Paducah, Kentucky, you're going to have very little competition for an acquisition, whereas in a market like New York City, you're going to have a tremendous amount of competition, and of course that tends to drive the price of the deal up, that competition for a deal. The transferability of the practice has an impact. Litigation support practices tend to be hard to transfer because they're so unique in the nature of the relationship, whereas a practice that has a general sort of practice with accounting, tax, and maybe some attest work is generally very easy to transfer. And the size of the practice can also have a factor, and we'll get into that in a minute. When you talk about the terms of a deal, there's 5 main terms that we're talking about. Most of us think about the value of a practice being the multiple. So everybody asks me, what are deals going for? Are they going for, if you're in a large city like New York City, we're still talking about deals over 1x. If you're in a smaller market, we may not even be talking about 1x anymore. But, when you talk about the value, that's the first thing people think about without thinking about what else goes into the terms that actually drive the value. So, for instance, there's 5 terms. The first of those is going to be the cash up front of any. Now, normally, when we're talking about cash up front, we're talking about an outright type sale where the seller's not going to stay on for very long, might be for less than a year, and actually we're starting the purchase payments pretty much out of the chute. In practices that are, unless they're a very large size, and if they are, they tend not to ever be outright sales. But if, let's say, we're talking about a practice under $1 million, it would normally be hard to get a deal done without some money up front. It's difficult for a seller to think about, I'm going to turn over my practice to this firm, walk away from it, and not get anything for it. Usually what we're seeing in those kind of situations are down payments of between 10 and 20%. It's varied quite a bit over the last 5 years because of the economy and the access to capital. Whereas 6-7 years ago, before the economic collapse, we saw down payments getting pretty large because there was ready access to capital, and that became kind of the norm at the lower end of the market. Then we went through a period where it was very difficult to get capital, and down payments almost completely disappeared. We're starting to see that come back now. Some capital's freed up, but generally, we're not involved in deals where down payments are going to exceed that 10 to 20% range, and we do an awful lot of deals where there's no down payment because most of ours are not outright sales actually. But how much down payment you should pay can be dependent on the time of the year. So for instance, if you're going to acquire a practice in November or December, you'd be much more inclined to give a down payment than if you were going to acquire a practice, say, in May or June, when you're just coming out of the busy season when most of the profits are generated. Another issue can be, how we deal with accounts receivable. In most deals, the seller is going to retain the accounts receivable, not in a merger, but in a typical acquisition it will. And if sometimes we've found, believe it or not, that it helps if we can give a down payment if the seller will let us retain the receivables for a year or two, and work off of those. And in essence, from our standpoint, from the buyer's standpoint, we are exchanging the down payment for the accounts receivable. So it doesn't really matter. It's all about cash flow. How well the client base pays obviously can have an impact on how much cash you're willing to pay up front. The second area of terms, and probably the most important, is retention, the retention clauses. The four different ways we see this dealt with are, full collection deals where all the payments are contingent on collections during the entire payout period. Usually those will run up to 6 years, oftentimes falling between 4 and 6 years. And so we're talking about, 20% a year for 5 years is a collection deal. A fixed deal, of course, is where the payments are fixed up front. We see very few of those happening. It's just, when it does happen, it's normally because it's a very, very small practice, and it's somebody who probably is not an experienced buyer who's going into that, but we do see some of that happen once in a while. But if you're going to have a fixed deal, you're basically taking on 100% of the risk for the client retention. Limited guarantees would be ones where the retention period is less than the payout period. That can be either because the payout period is very long, say it stretches out to 8 or 10 years, or it can be because the retention period was negotiated down to, say, something like 2 years. We'll talk in a little bit about why a 1-year retention deal is the riskiest way to go. But 2 years or more, say you've got a 2-year retention deal with a 5-year payout period, that'd be a limited guarantee. And an economy clause is a way of addressing why a client is lost by the buyer. So an economy clause might say, we've got a 2-year or we've got a 5-year guarantee, but if the client is lost because of the other way around, we've got a guarantee, but if a client is lost because of something that happens that would have happened otherwise, even if this had been in the seller's hands, for instance, the client goes out of business or the business is sold, then there's a different treatment for that kind of client than there is for a normal client who might be lost because of something the buyer might have done or not done. The next area of terms would be profitability. And when we're talking about profitability, certainly the seller's current profitability is somewhat relevant. What's really more relevant is the buyer's anticipated profitability. And let me give you an example why. Let's say we're talking about a really small practice. Guy operates out of his house. His wife answers the phone. He has virtually no overhead. And as a result, he's got an 85% profit margin, maybe 90%. And then he decides, you know what, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't like people coming to my house anymore. So he moves into an office suite. He hires a receptionist, and all of a sudden his profit margin goes down to 35%. At what point was that practice worth more to you? It obviously wasn't worth any more or less under those circumstances because you're going to move them into your office anyway. So the seller's profitability can only be an indicator of profitability for you. And even though a practice might, have one margin in a seller's hands, it might have an entirely different margin in your hands. What should you use that information for? Well, of course, I'm not suggesting that because you can make a practice more profitable, you should necessarily pass all of that gain down to the seller, but it might make you more motivated to actually do the deal. So say, for instance, in one case, you're able to move a practice into your offices and with very little incremental overhead, and in fact, you can absorb almost all of the client service needs within your existing staff. That practice could be extremely profitable to you, whereas a practice that would require an investment in incremental overhead, such as additional space, where you don't have the capacity to actually absorb the practice into an existing staff resources, that practice wouldn't be as profitable, and you might be more motivated and might be willing to maybe give in on some other issues in the case of one that's more profitable. The tax ramifications of the deal also make a difference, of course. If it's treated as a consulting deal, where it's deductible as paid, very likely could be worth more to you than if you have to amortize the payments over 15 years. And then, of course, the length of the payout period. Most deals, especially those that are not asset deals, don't have interest associated with them. So a deal that pays out over 5 years is going to have less value than a deal that pays out over 7 or 8 years. The deal that pays out over 3 is worth less, obviously, than the one that pays out over 5. So the length of the payout period is an issue. So the multiple is actually the effect, and the cause is all the other terms. So for instance, the lower the down payment, the longer the payout period, the higher the profitability, the longer the guarantees, the higher the multiple should be. On the other hand, if you flip those back around, the higher the down payment, the shorter the payout period, and so forth, the less the multiple should be. So for instance, what we see oftentimes is a deal that might go for, say, 1.1x as a consulting deal. The buyer and the seller might agree at a 0.9 or 0.95x if the deal is treated as a capital gain deal. That's a good example of a cause and effect. You know, the issue of how large a practice is will have a very direct impact on how much it's worth. Typically, larger firms go for lower multiples and longer payout periods. And I went too fast there, sorry. And why is that? Well, the biggest reason is there's normally fewer buyers available for larger practices. So if you've got a $5 or $10 million practice, in many markets, you're only going to have a handful of buyers that are relevant to that practice in other markets other than, say, New York or LA. Whereas a smaller practice, a $500,000 to $1 million practice, is going to have a significant number of buyers, and therefore there's more competition for the practice. It's a supply and demand issue. The second issue is that smaller practices tend to have less incremental overhead required, and oftentimes can be absorbed into the practice with no additional space being acquired, with maybe no additional staff being hired, and so forth, whereas a larger practice doesn't have that opportunity. So the smaller practice will create a much larger profitability opportunity, and therefore will tend to motivate buyers to pay more for it. Retention periods can actually be shorter in larger practices, and in fact in mergers sometimes there is no retention period at all. And the reason for this is, to a great extent, is because more of the clients in a larger firm are going to be brand loyal. They're loyal to the firm as opposed to loyal to an individual partner. Now there's always individual partner issues and there's always some loyalty, but in the very small practices, the client base may be 100% dependent on an individual partner relationship that needs to be transitioned over time. The larger practice tends never to be a total sale. If you've got 4 or 5 partners in a firm, it's unlikely that all 4 or 5 partners are going to sell to a buyer unless it's a corporate buyer, for instance, like CBIZ. And normally you're going to have a combination of selling and merging and so forth, and we'll talk more about that in a second. There's 4 different kinds of alternative deals besides what we think of. When we think of deals, and those are going to be an outright sale, what we call a 2-stage deal, a cull-out sale, and then what's the difference between a sale and a merger. We'll talk about each of those. An outright sale, the purchase payments basically begin immediately. So somebody might say, look, I've done my last tax return, it's June, I'm going to sell my practice, I'll stick around for the summer and fall and help you guys get introduced to the clients, but I'm pretty much out of here. I want to sell my practice. In those situations, the purchase payments would start pretty much right up front. If the seller needs to keep working, they do it on a part-time basis, probably, some kind of per diem type rate. If they're paid at all, normally, if all they're doing is transition work, that would be considered, the compensation for the practice might be considered compensation for those services. The disadvantage in an outright sale is you just don't have a lot of time for transition. So in that case, the clients are getting a letter, they're getting a phone call, maybe some of them have a meeting, but they're pretty much being told that the seller is out, the buyer's in, and the client's asked to now make a decision. Are they going to retain the new buyer or not? Statistics tell us that about 1/3 of all your clients know who they're going to go to if something ever happens to you. There's somebody in second place, there might even be somebody in third place, somebody they go to church with, some firm that's been calling on them for the last 5 or 10 years, a brother-in-law. And so when you ask a seller, make a decision, do you like this buyer or not, who they don't know, they very well may say, you know what, I always knew this was going to happen, and when it did, this is what I was going to do. So you tend to have much more difficulty in an outright sale with retention. The Brokers kind of specialized in these types of deals. They're clean. They create a sales price. Makes it easier for them to earn their commission. But they tend to have the worst outcomes. The interesting thing is that buyers tend to be attracted to them because they seem like they're more clean. That you don't have to mess with, working with the seller over a long period of time, and you feel like, gee, this is what all I wanted was your clients anyway. But keep in mind that it's much more difficult to transition these practices that way. A better approach, we think, when there's time to do it, is a two-stage deal. In a two-stage deal, we have the stage one would be the seller basically merges into your firm. They combine their practice with yours. Doesn't have to necessarily be in the same office, but they start operating under your firm brand name, under your systems and so forth. They start the transition process. Remember, this can take up to 5 years, so the transition can be over a much more gradual point of time. And as far as the clients are concerned, it's a merger. So they see the seller now operating within your systems under your brand, and they become more familiar with how you operate that way and become, they gradually come to appreciate your firm. The seller tends to maintain reasonable control, normally only over client matters. So they have to fit within your quality control system, but you're going to let them make day-to-day decisions about the services and the billing typically and so forth, who gets assigned to the client engagements and so forth. And they take on a principals or non-equity partner role. They don't get equity in your firm. So even though they're held out as a partner to the outside world, even internally, contractually, they're a contract partner. Everything is determined by a contract separate from your partner agreement. And the most important thing from their point of view is they maintain their compensation. We do everything we can to try to keep them whole in compensation. And the way we typically do that is we'd say, if your profit margin has been 35%, then we'll pay you 35% of the collections from your clients going forward. And you might ask yourself, well, why would I do that? I'm not going to make any money if I do that. And typically what we find is that because of the synergy that's available from the deal, that even if they don't move into your offices, you'll usually pick up about of their volume in additional. But if they move into your offices, it can be as much as 15 to 20%. And you haven't paid anything up front for the practice. You're not paying them their purchase payments until you get out of this stage one, which we'll get into in a minute. And then the other thing that happens is, there tends to be significant growth opportunity in the practice. So that growth, although it might be shared with them, depending on how the growth is generated, also can create significant. That incremental growth can be very profitable for the buyer. So stage two is when you start paying for the practice. So now keep in mind, let's say we set up a 3-year stage one. During that 3 years, they're in the process of transitioning the practice. We get to the end of the 3rd year, and they go into either a part-time role or a retired role. And that's when we start paying for the practice, as if it was an outright sale at that point in time. So it's still usually contingent. In fact, I've never done one that wasn't contingent. If they keep working, they're going to probably do it at a per diem rate. We might pay them a third of their billing rate on billable time. And we're now paying for a practice that has already transitioned to you. The retention rate is going to be extremely high. The day the seller walked out the door, if it's done properly, is a non-event for the clients and the staff. So, the practice, you tend to have a much stronger outcome. We feel like this is the best approach for transition of a practice and retention of clients short of a merger. A cull-out sale would be selling a part of a practice or retaining a part of a practice. So as an example, I just working on a deal here recently where the seller has a very large peer review practice. And it's not something that the buyer is necessarily interested in doing because it tends not to be leveraged work. So the solution we're looking at is the seller retaining that part of the practice, continuing to operate it within the buyer's practice while he's still there, but then keeping it and not, of course, we're not paying him for it. So from the seller's perspective, that work would probably be almost 100% profit because he's doing all the work himself. And so it's lucrative from his standpoint. It creates more value from his standpoint, and we're not taking on a part of the practice that we don't want. You can also do this. We see this oftentimes happening with wealth management practices that are buried within CPA firms. The seller might want to keep the wealth management practice, and that'll work if you don't have a wealth management practice. Obviously, if you do, you probably wanted to merge it into yours. An example of selling a part of the practice might be selling off an office. So the components that we're selling off could be a certain portion of the clients, or not necessarily selling off, but retaining a portion of the clients, maybe a certain area of service, maybe a certain location. I've seen situations where firms would have a satellite office run by one partner who was in a succession mode, and they didn't feel like any of their partners wanted to move down there, so we found an external buyer for that office. Okay, the differences between a sale and a merger. The biggest difference is, the ownership status of the seller after the deal. If the seller comes on, becomes an equity partner in your firm, and he then signs on to your owner agreement, and of course then the terms of your owner agreement become the seller's terms. So the value of the deal to the seller is driven by your owner agreement. And really, this is as much a hiring decision as anything else. It's not really. I don't look at it as much as an acquisition as I do as almost hiring somebody with a book of business. So we'll get a little more into how to deal with mergers in a second here. I'll go to the second polling question now.
Okay, the second polling question today is about your firm's primary objective for acquisition. So you see 4 choices there. Just pick the one that's the primary objective, whether that's growing revenues, acquiring talent, cross-selling existing services, or opening a new market or office. We'll keep the poll open for about 15 more seconds, just to give everyone a chance to answer. And another reminder that you do have to do all of the polls in order to get the CPE credit today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. The results are there. Terry, 78% said that their primary goal is to grow revenues. 11% cross-selling existing services, and then 7% new market, 4% acquire talent.
Okay. That's exactly what I expected. Okay, so what should a good target look like? When we talk about why deals fail, the number one reason why we hear that deals fail is because of a conflict in cultures. And so we're going to, I think that becomes a really important issue with respect to mergers, not so much with, an acquisition, an outright sale, or a two-stage deal. If you're not creating a long-term partner relationship, we don't have to worry so much about culture issues. Our main concern should be what's it going to take to keep the clients, keep the staff, and make sure that the economics of the deal are profitable. The issues that you want to worry about with respect to culture in one of these types of acquisitions are mostly what we call in front of the door culture issues. Those are things that are going to affect the outside world, which is made up mostly of the clients. So they would be issues like billing, what you charge the clients, the fees you charge, the services that you offer, how and when, where those services are going to be provided, who's going to provide them. The things that are going to affect the client experience are the cultural issues that are going to affect the outcome of the deal. The stuff that's behind the door, unless it's going to have a major impact on staff, isn't going to have so much of an impact on the deal because the deal's a sale or a two-stage deal. On the other hand, if it's a merger, culture becomes a lot more critical. When we talk about culture, most people, when you ask them to define it, they basically tell you look and feel. Well, I'll know it when I see it. And it's very difficult to do due diligence about look and feel. Am I making the right decision or not? Is it just me, or is it really something I need to worry about? I actually think that there's some very specific, tangible things you can look at that define a firm's culture, and they're organized into 3 areas. Organizational issues are the things popping up on the screen. Work ethic. If you've got a practice where your staff on average are generating 1,900 chargeable hours, where the partner's generating over 2,000 chargeable hours, that's a much different culture than a practice where the staff average, say, 1,500 and the partners are averaging 1,000 or 1,100. Office facilities, needless to say, the quality of the office facilities, where they're located, are they downtown, or are they in the suburbs? Those are cultural issues. The environment in the office, is it very formal? Is it loose? Is it almost, to where people refer to each other by first names, or where the partners are expected to be referred to as Mr.? The mobility of the workforce, are they allowed to work from home? Do they spend a lot of time in the office? Does the technology support a mobile workforce or not? Some firms are still struggling with the fact that they have a problem with files leaving the office. They have a problem with staff working from home. The seasonality of the practice. Is it a heavy tax practice, or one that's spread out more throughout the year? What sort of policies and procedures do they have? How strict are they? The personality of the people involved. Is it somebody that you feel comfortable around, or is it somebody that has a personality trait that makes it difficult for you? Growth orientation. A firm that is heavily oriented towards organic growth versus one that's pretty static. Those are two entirely different cultures, and you can look at the historical growth rates and determine whether that's the case. Do they emphasize growth through organic means, or do they emphasize it through M&A? I've worked with firms that have done as many as 50 or 60 mergers in the last 20 years and have grown to over $150 million in volume, almost completely through mergers. That's an entirely different culture than one that's done, one or two mergers and has, almost all their growth is organic and almost all their people came through internal means. Do they have a gatekeeper mentality, or are they more team-oriented? Do they refer to their clients as being their clients or the firm's clients? Obviously, this one firm concept. In the client service approach, how are clients served? Are they served within the office? Do a lot of clients come to their office and have more of a face-to-face orientation in the office, or are there clients that are served in the field, or maybe that have a completely virtual relationship? They hardly ever see their clients. How do they market? Are they heavy advertisers? Do they have business development people, or are they somebody that depends on mostly networking through their partners? Billing rates can be an issue, of course. I think it's overrated as an issue. Typically, that's one of the things that I think firms use to qualify a firm right up front, and they do it erroneously. If you've got, say, an average partner billing rate of $300 an hour, and you're talking to a firm that has an average partner billing rate of $175 an hour, you might conclude there's no way we could ever do a deal. What you don't understand might be that the reason why their rates are $175 are because they don't have this luxury of leveraging their time to lower-level staff, and so they're oftentimes doing work that a lower-level staff person would do. And in your firm, it could be that because they have access to a stronger staff mix, that they'll be able to increase their billing rates substantially at the partner level. And what's really an issue shouldn't be billing rates as much as what they charge their clients. If you're needing to charge for a project $25,000 that they're charging $10,000 for, that's a problem. But if you can look at the project and say, yeah, that fee would be close to what we'd be doing, you don't have as much of an issue. So billing rates can be a misleading metric. Their billing policies, technology, client demographics, and so forth. And then finally, the partner issues. The partner compensation system, how are partners paid? That's a huge cultural issue. Are they paid based on managing books of business, or are they paid based on more team-oriented metrics? Well, how does the owner agreement deal with allocating value and establishing value? How are partners measured in terms of their performance? Are they mostly billed? Is it mostly like how many billable hours you have and how large your book of business is, or are there other more strategic things in the performance measurement system? The partner compensation level and range is a huge indicator. If you have a firm that has a very tight range of partners, that's what tends to be one that's more collegial, where it's important that everybody gets along. That's not so important we call out the outliers, whether they're good or bad, as opposed to a firm that has a huge range of compensation. A firm that pays a lot of compensation based on equity, and you have unequal equity, is a different culture than one that pays more based on current performance. The governance system, and of course the one firm concept. And we'll get to our last polling question now, Nikki.
Okay, our third polling question, this is the final one of the day, is about your firm's willingness to admit new equity partners. So the first answer is definitely, that's an objective for us. Yes, if they meet our strict criteria. You'd prefer not to, but you might, or no, never. Again, this is the third and final polling question, so take a moment to answer it. It open for about 10 more seconds. Okay, it looks like nearly everyone has responded. 54% said they would prefer not to, but they might. And then pretty evenly split amongst the other three options.
Okay. And again, I think it's difficult when you go into, a project of looking for firms to acquire when you have certain must-haves, just as like a seller has. The more must-haves you have, the more difficult, the less attractive you're going to be to a larger group of sellers. I think it's obviously better to keep an open mind, be flexible, and I'm not saying you suggest if your average partner is managing $1.5 million book of business that you should admit somebody with a $300,000 book of business as an equity partner, but staying flexible on this issue is important. Okay, let's talk about some special situations. Partners with different timetables, career goals. Some may want immediate succession, some may want succession in 2 to 5 years, and some may want a long-term career. I think the mistake that firms make is trying to fit everybody into the same package. So, the guy that wants immediate, I think it's better to look oftentimes in these cases as these being 3 different deals that we're going to do, even though it's one firm. So the guys that want immediate succession, we deal with as an outright sale, pretty much. I think you'll have a better outcome in the case of this type of deal than you would if it was a standalone seller. But in essence, we say, look, let's negotiate what value you have in your firm, and let's deal with that as an acquisition, and we'll put you on a part-time compensation rate, and let's move forward. The guys that want succession in 2 to 5 years, put them on a 2-stage deal. Go back to the technique that we talked about earlier, and basically they come in as a contract partner. They still don't become an equity partner, but they have more of an ongoing full-time role for that stage 1, and then when we get to stage 2, we deal with the buyout in some fashion. It may still be driven by something similar to your owner agreement, or it may be something similar to what you might have negotiated with the guys that want an outright sale. And then those that want a long-term career, of course, the question is, do they meet the criteria for becoming equity partners? Now, keep in mind that, they're bringing with them, even though they might only own 5% of a, $5 million firm. And so you might conclude, well, in essence, they only bring $250,000 worth of value. But if the other partners in their firm are going to be leaving soon, we might be able to, from the standpoint of evaluating their potential, be able to ascribe some of that value that's being left behind by the other partners as value that they not necessarily are going to get, but can manage. So all of a sudden, if we can envision them managing a larger book of business because of what they're inheriting from the partners they're bringing with them that are leaving, then the criteria might be different than otherwise. Another special situation, majority partner owns 60% equity, but only takes 35% of the compensation in the firm, and you use a compensation-based agreement. So how do we deal with that? Well, first off, it's difficult to ask anybody to take a step back and comp her value. So let's say this is a 3 million, 4-partner firm with $3 million. The majority partner might think that his value is roughly $1.8 million. In your firm, it might be worth $1 million or less. It's hard for him to swallow the fact that all of a sudden he's taken that kind of hit on his value. One way to get around that is to create a credit, maybe in between, an exception to your agreement where everybody comes in and he gets a premium on his buyout and his other partners get a credit, which kind of puts them back in the place they were at when they started, and doesn't create any additional need for you to create additional value for the other partners. We also have used other techniques to get around this kind of deal, but there's always a way to get around this thing, and it's a shame when a deal falls apart because our agreement doesn't fit their situation. Clients and staff or leases that you don't want. For clients, think about a cull-out. For leases, think about an aggressive sublease. Oftentimes, let's say we're talking about a 3-year lease. We've got maybe a $75,000 a year obligation to it. And so we think about that being, wow, that's $225,000. That's a lot of money. But if we were dealing with a sublease, even if we had, say, a 1/3 discount for the sublease, we can cut that down to $75,000, and all of a sudden it might not become a material issue. And how we deal with that on either side becomes a lot easier to do if you're dealing with a smaller number. On the staff, maybe you can counsel them out. You know, firing somebody right up front is a tough way to start a merger. So avoiding that, I think, is important. Let's not worry about what's going to happen in the first year. Let's think about the fact that, you know, most firms are going to have 15% attrition naturally every year. And it could be we can deal with this through natural attrition or attrition that we've kind of nudged along. When we talk about equity allocations, the most important issue here is to avoid the egos. You know, I see a lot of times firms saying, well, my firm's worth more than theirs. We should get a lot more equity. Our $5 million in volume isn't equal to their $2 million in volume pro rata, so I want to make sure we come out with more than our share of it. And that's really, you know, it doesn't make any sense in my mind. The issues are, what does equity mean in your firm? How does it deal with governance? How does it factor into your compensation, if at all? How does it factor into your retirement, if at all? I mean, if you've got a compensation-based system, equity doesn't mean much in your retirement buyouts. And what capital contributions are required? And as long as we deal with the equity and what the impact of it is with respect to those issues, the dollars and cents, then it makes sense with how we come out with the equity allocations. Should you guarantee comp? You know, one of the things I hear sometimes is partners in the acquiring firm say, my comp's not guaranteed. Why should I be guaranteeing their comp? Well, you're not really guaranteeing their comp per se. What you're guaranteeing is the allocation of how comp is going to be allocated within your firm. You should never guarantee comp. In my mind, it isn't conditionally guaranteed, meaning it's conditioned on the amount of volume that sticks after the merger and conditioned on the amount of profitability, which is oftentimes driven by partner billable hours. So we might have a conditional guarantee that says, we'll guarantee your comp as long as you're for 2 years, as long as your volume is maintained and as long as your billable hours are maintained. And all we're talking about then is protecting them from whatever subjectivity there is in your compensation system that they don't understand how to manage yet. It's hard for them to understand something that somebody who's been your partner for 20 years knows just intuitively. So that's really what a compensation guarantee is all about. It's not guaranteeing them from economic risk. It's guaranteeing them from the subjectivity and vulgarity of whatever compensation system you're using. When should you say no to a deal? You know, you can always say no. You can't say yes after you've said no, and that's the most important issue. So up front, you know, it's really about the clients, services, and location. If you don't like the clients, don't like the services they offer, don't want to have a place where they're located, don't go any further. You know, then get past the seller's must-haves. If you can't overcome some of them that are unrealistic because of your business plan or because of their transition plan is not going to work, or there's just their terms are ridiculous, obviously at that point you can say no. You know, at that point, once you get through that, the quicker you can get an offer in front of them, the quicker you gain control of the deal. So, you know, we typically try to get an offer in front of somebody after about the second meeting at most. Sometimes it's even after the first, and in some cases you have to go beyond that. But if you go past 3 meetings and you're still not talking about deal terms, you're wasting your time, in my opinion. So the quicker you get an offer in front of them, the quicker you're going to get control of the conversation, because now all of a sudden it tends to shift to the buyer at that point. Once you get agreement on terms, perform your due diligence to your heart's content, and at that point in time, you know, if you can't overcome some of the issues, then walk away from it. But there's no point in going through an exhaustive due diligence exercise if you don't even know what terms you're talking about, because it could be that you're just wasting both firms' times. And I also think that doing that sometimes can be just a means of kind of delaying a decision. And then, of course, execute the contract. You know, our experience is that these are the things that make for a good buyer. Clear and concise in their goals, able to express to the seller why they're doing the deal, what their long-term goals are for their firm. They're a good communicator. They stay in touch. They don't deal with communication in a passive-aggressive way. They're constantly, you know, where are we? Let's stay in touch. Let's keep working on this thing. A good listener. Sellers love to talk about themselves. The worst meeting you can have is where you're talking 90% of the time. As with anything, you're selling yourself here, and so in the sales meeting where you do that, it usually doesn't work. You're visionary about where your firm's going. You're able to articulate that. You're flexible in your terms and your plan. You're willing to adapt to the situation and willing to adapt to make the deal more attractive for the seller within reason. You have a sense of urgency, keep the deal moving. Time kills all deals, and eventually it does kill all deals. The longer a deal takes to get done, the less likely it is going to happen. You have the capacity, and you can articulate this to the seller. Keep in mind, the sellers, this is oftentimes a succession plan for them, and they're leaving their firm, and they're concerned about who's going to replace me. Being able to articulate who's going to replace them and how that's going to work is very important to sellers. Compassionate about the seller's transition, understanding what they're going through, what are the concerns they have, the fears they have. Go back to the slide that I talked about that on. And then finally, you have the capital to finance the deal. I mean, typically you're going to be looking at, in most deals, even if you pay nothing up front, you should count on spending somewhere between 20 and 30% of the volume of that firm in the first year. That's going to, oftentimes you're going to be, unless it's a merger, oftentimes you're going to be replacing working capital. You're going to have some moving expenses. You're going to have investment in infrastructure and so forth. So making sure you've got your capital in place, because when you don't have that in place, it tends to drive you to terms that are maybe unreasonable for the seller. And with that, certainly we didn't. Did we get any questions, Nikki, during the?
No, we didn't have any questions today.
Okay. So if you have any questions about what we've just talked about, I'm happy to answer them. Send me an email, or you can give me a call. And appreciate your time today, and hope you can join us for a future webinar.
Great, thanks, Terry. Just a reminder, don't close your browser just yet. Once the webinar ends, the survey will pop up. You'll complete that, and then within 2 business days, you'll hear from me with your CPE certificate. You'll get a follow-up email today, and that'll have links to some articles that Terry has recommended and a link to download the slides if you didn't have a chance to do so already. And if you have any questions, you can just reply to that email, and we'd be happy to answer them for you. But thanks again for attending, and we look forward to having you on a future webinar. Bye.